Hi guys, welcome back to No Culty Vibes, or welcome if you are new. Today's video is going to be a deep dive into the timeline of events surrounding Mike Bickle's allegations and scandal within the IHOPKC community. If you don't know what IHOP is or IHOPKC, there are other videos for that. This isn't the video for that on the internet. I highly recommend you go watch the Heaven Bent podcast. Tara Jean did a whole season on IHOP KC, and there are a couple of really great resources where you can find more information about this. And in fact, I linked a bunch of them in the show notes, in the description, depending on where you're watching this or listening to this, as a lot of my sources for where I looked for a lot of this information. But today we are going to be solely focusing on the allegations, the most recent allegations against Mike Bickle that came out this past October. Really quickly, if you are new here and you don't know who I am, my name is Cassie Marie. I am a content creator and an artist. I was in a really culty business coaching relationship back in 2018, and I was really traumatized from a specific coach client and also friendship relationship. And around that time, I also was really invested in a show called Leah Remini's Scientology in the Aftermath. And I became super interested in cults and cult psychology and understanding narcissism. And I realized it was because I was abused and traumatized in this coaching relationship and friendship. And through researching cults and learning so much about all of that, I realized that I was part of a couple different culty communities or cult-like situations, I guess. One of those communities was Morning Star, which is a church run by Rick Joyner. A lot of you may already know of this, some of you may not, but Rick Joyner is really close friends with Mike Bickle, and they follow very similar theologies, and I think they both are cult leaders. I personally was involved in Morning Star in Wilmington, North Carolina from 2012 to I think like 2015 or 2016 probably when I moved away. And early on in 2012, I did a prophetic ministry internship that was very similar to IHOP U's school that they do, and very similar, obviously more similar to the Morning Star School of Ministry, both of which I realized are unaccredited college-like programs that these institutions kind of promote as college programs. I knew back in 2012 and 2016 a few people that were from IHOP that came to Morningstar either visiting or moved there. So this whole topic feels very close to home. I actually didn't consider Morningstar a cult when I first started understanding cults. I thought like the culty relationship I was in was specifically with this business coach. But after learning more and dissecting, I have a very different opinion of that. I was kind of like on the outskirts of the cult of Morningstar and really the cult of Rick Joyner. I wasn't really near Rick Joyner's inner circle in a lot of ways, but this just all feels very close to home. And that's why I was interested in this topic and Mike Bickle in particular, and wanted to follow the events that were unfolding since October and these allegations came forward. This deep dive took me forever to look into and piece together. I don't know how long this video or podcast is going to be. I don't know how long it's going to take me to actually talk through each of these points, but it took me forever to figure them out. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to do it, because I was confused by the timeline of events. And I figured if I was confused, some other people might be confused. And I wished that there was just a video or audio that I could listen to someone kind of go through step by step some of the nonsense that has unfolded since these allegations began. And even though this is a deep dive and we are going to go into details on some of these things that have occurred, some of the events that have occurred, I did still leave some out because they weren't as significant to the storyline and would have just taken so much extra time to go over. And since they weren't that huge of a deal, I left them out. But in the description, there is a link to the Roy's report, which is Julie Roy's website. She's a journalist that exposes a lot of church abuse, and she has a whole investigation into Mike Bickle kind of from the beginning, and there's even like 1 or 2 articles from before these allegations came out. So I've linked that in the description. I also linked the Heaven Bent podcast, which I mentioned earlier, in the description. And I also linked a website, Church Watch, that someone sent to me on Instagram that has another timeline of events, which I wish I had found when I started researching this. I was sent it towards the end of my research, but they actually have a lot more details. So if you are interested in going through this from the very beginning with every single thing, I highly recommend you check out that link, as there are details, links, screenshots. They have all of the receipts. One more thing I wanted to quickly share before we get into it. I am going to be adding some of my commentary on cults and how some of these behaviors and some of these events strike me as very cult-like. I am, as you may be able to tell, coming at this from a perspective of someone who used to be somewhat part of an adjacent community and is now very much out of all of these communities. I do not consider myself really Christian anymore at all. I have definitely left this specific theology and belief system, and in a lot of ways I think I have left the faith as well. So I hope that you will, if you are still a believer, if you are still in this prophetic world, you will listen to this with an open mind. I don't have anything against people who still believe in the prophetic or are still Christian. I think there are healthier ways to practice these beliefs, and obviously there are healthier ways to be a Christian without causing direct harm to other people, like what has happened within IHOPKC and Mike Bickle. And honestly, this is the most recent allegation against Mike Bickle and IHOPKC, but there have been issues with IHOP for a long time. There have been other abuses, other harms caused to people, some of which I may deep dive on in the future as well. But I do have a lot of issues with it. I hope that if you are listening to it from an opposite perspective of me, you still listen with an open mind, especially to some of the things that I point out as really cult like, and listen to the harm that is being caused by this group of men towards not just these women and Jane Does, but their own communities at large. Last thing I want to say before we get into the deep dive is this does contain some difficult topics of spiritual abuse and sexual abuse and just things that are really difficult. So please take care when you are listening to this. If you are not in a space to listen, that's fine. Go turn this off, go listen to something else. You do not need to listen to this stuff. But if you do feel like you are in a headspace to listen, just proceed with caution. So I have organized this timeline of events in a way that makes sense to me. So we are going to start at, let's see, October 20th, when Mike Bickle preached a sermon at Forerunner Church about a black horse prophecy. I don't know how out of the ordinary this was for him to come up and preach this black horse theme, but he talked a lot about himself being like a David, and this being towards the end times. I'm pretty sure Mike Bickle and Rick Joyner believe in a lot of end times theology and that we are in the end times. And he was saying that there will be a lot of betrayals against a David like figure in the end times, and that he may be getting ready to experience one of the greatest betrayals of his life. And this is just something that the Lord told him, and it's likely going to happen. And we'll talk a little bit more about this towards the end of this, because this October 20th Black Horse prophecy is referenced later in some later events that occur. And this is also a very typical cult like tactic where Mike Bickle is very obviously getting up in front of his congregation, his group of people, his followers, people that really believe in him, and he's prepping them for something to occur. He's prepping them for something to come out and giving an alternative explanation ahead of time before anyone even suspects anything or knows what's going on. And it becomes really clear later that he is doing that very strategically and on purpose. And then on October 27th, IHOPKC has a meeting where the church announces, I don't know if this was to just leaders. This wasn't a Sunday morning like sermon. It wasn't a church service sermon. I don't know, maybe IHOPKC gets together regularly on Friday nights. Someone who is more familiar with this can enlighten everyone in the comments somewhere. But there was a meeting where IHOPKC announced that allegations were going to come out against Mike Bickle. They did not elaborate on these, and they did ask people not to refer to these allegations as the Black Horse Prophecy. And I have to wonder if some of the leadership team didn't know that Mike Bickle was so strategically doing this and realized immediately how bad that sermon looked being preached just a week before they announced this. I know that the leadership team did know what was going on, but I wonder if they just realized how bad that looked. And that's why they decided to tell everybody not to refer to it as that. During this meeting, a man named Dean Briggs, who is former IHOPKC leadership, stands up and he told leaders that this is an unacceptable level of transparency, and he called this announcement righteous bullshit. And this video went kind of viral on the internet. At this point, we don't know much else. People didn't really know exactly what was going on, but it seemed clear that IHOPKC knew a lot more than they were sharing. And Dean was trying to point out that there's a lot more that people deserve to know. Julie Roys on the Roys Report actually obtained a copy of the Black Horse Prophecy sermon. And this is just a couple of snippets of it that I grabbed. But you can see in this part of the notes that a betrayal is a big thing that needs to happen or is going to happen for the church to be transformed in the end times. And then this part talks about how Satan's most effective weapon in the end times is accusation. So again, Mike Bickle prepping his congregation for someone to accuse him of something. I also think the whole Black Horse sermon is just so glaringly obvious. I think it's hilarious and is a testament to the fact that a lot of leaders or cult-like leaders or people in these positions of power think that they are untouchable and think that they will be believed no matter what. And some people will believe them. I have no doubt that this worked for some members of that congregation. Then on October 28th, we get the official statement released by former IHOPKC leaders. And it is on this day and a couple of days to follow where this really catches on and people start spreading this news around and understanding what's going on. So this statement was actually posted on, I'm not sure how you pronounce this, but Florianopolis House of Prayers website, which is a Brazilian church founded in 2013 by Dwayne Roberts, who was a founding member of IHOPKC. And this statement accused Mike Bickle of clergy sexual abuse with multiple women spanning decades. Initially, no details of this accusation were released in this statement, and that was in an effort to protect the Jane Does. But the letter was signed by Dwayne Roberts, Brian Kim, who was also a former executive leadership team member, and Wes Martin, who was the former pastor of Forerunner Church. Throughout a lot of this saga, a lot of these shenanigans, a lot of people have accused Dwayne Roberts of publicly posting this stuff to social media and blasting it out into the world. And he maintains that he always only released it on his church's website. But in the days of the interwebs and social media, from both sides of this, they had to know that this was going to be talked about far and wide. With Mike Bickle and IHOPKC's reach in general, you would think that they would be aware that no matter what, this was going to garner a lot of attention. So I'm not going to read this entire statement to you. If you are watching this on YouTube, you can pause it to read. If you are listening on the podcast and want to go to YouTube to read it or find the links in the show notes, you can do that. I did highlight a couple of parts that stood out to me as really culty, and also stood out to me as the people who put this statement together understanding coercive control and cult-like influence. This was initially brought to Mike Bickle, and he refused to meet with people. Instead, he used manipulating and intimidating tactics towards victims to isolate them and discredit them. Obviously, if we had a little bit more information on what those were, I could compare them to a couple of different things for you to describe just how they are indications of narcissistic abuse or coercive control. But the isolation part of this really stood out to me because that is something that cult leaders will absolutely do when they are trying to control a situation or control a narrative. A little bit later in this deep dive, I'm going to talk about Stephen Hassan's BITE model that he developed as a model to explain authoritarian or coercive control or undue influence. BITE stands for behavior control, behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And isolation can fall under emotional control, but also information control because they are trying to control the narrative and what people hear and don't hear. They also gave a little bit of detail just saying that Mike Bickle's misconduct was sexual in nature, where the marriage covenant was not honored. Furthermore, the allegations made also reveal that Mike Bickle used his position of spiritual authority over the victims to manipulate them. So again, very clearly dealing with manipulation and coercion. Then on October 29th, that very Sunday, during their church service, the IHOPKC leadership team announced awareness of these serious allegations of sexual immorality directed against Mike Bickle, and they announced this to the church community at large. They claimed to be taking the allegations seriously and searching for truth. Stuart Greaves, in particular, said IHOPKC was engaging with outside parties to assess and arbitrate these allegations, but did not give any specifics or additional information. He stated that Mike Bickle agreed to remove himself from ministry for the time being. So again, what struck me when this initially happened was we have so little information. All the outside world, or even like the IHOPKC community outside of the executive leadership team, knew at this point was that allegations were made. We think IHOPKC is taking this seriously. We don't know what the allegations were, and we don't know what is going to happen moving forward, except for Mike Bickle is at least temporarily agreeing to being removed from leadership. Again, not removing himself, but agreeing to be removed. After this announcement was made and it was talked about that Mike Bickle was agreeing to be removed from leadership, we started seeing a lot of different responses from a lot of different people in the IHOP community and I think the prophetic community at large. There were a lot of people sharing opinions, a lot of people coming to realizations that they had not yet maybe come to, people already taking sides. And something that happens when a cult leader is faced with allegations or faced with a scandal is a lot of times people in their inner circle or their most loyal followers, or I think the word for them would be like sycophants, like people who are just so loyal and will do anything that the cult leader says, no matter what, and will do their dirty work and come to their defense. I've also been heard have them being referred to as flying monkeys in reference to the Wizard of Oz. But you will often see people start to stand up for this cult leader, and the leader won't address anything to begin with. They will rely on those closest to them to defend them in a variety of different ways. And the first time we saw this, maybe not the first time, there might have been something that happened right before this, which I will mention in a minute. But the first time I saw this was on November 3rd. Rick Joyner posted a video, one of his Rick rants in defense of Mike Bickle. He said that he would not be surprised if these allegations amounted to a big old nothing burger, which I think is extremely offensive and a wild thing to say when someone is faced with allegations as serious as clergy sexual abuse and someone literally using their position of spiritual authority to manipulate, coerce, and harm someone. especially when like the larger community doesn't have any details of anything. To say it's nothing is clearly taking a stand one way or another. And Rick Joyner, I wouldn't say is like a follower of Mike Bickle. He's a cult leader in his own right. And I think Morningstar is a cult very similar to IHOPKC. But I think that the men in leadership that are coming to his defense, or not just the men in leadership, but like the men who have their cults of their own, will stand up for men who go through something like this because they don't want to be next. They are in the system that the cult leader is in. They are benefiting from the same systems. They are likely benefiting from the same tactics of manipulation and coercive control. And they want other people to stick up for them and defend them when they are accused of things. And I'm just heavily side eyeing Rick Joyner right now. I'm not suggesting that allegations of sexual abuse will come out, but from what I've seen and what I know, I wouldn't be surprised if allegations of harm of some kind were to come out, just because that is the nature of these organizations that use authoritarian control and undue influence to run and to maintain status and power and really to get money. So I think someone like Rick Joyner would immediately jump to someone like Mike Bickle's defense because they don't want to be accused of anything that they could potentially be accused of in the future. Then on November 5th, IHOPKC announced at a church service that they hired a law firm, Stinson LLP, to conduct a third party investigation. A third party investigation is something that was requested by what we will refer to in the future as the complaint group or the advocate group. They are the group of former IHOPKC leaders that brought the allegations forward in the first place. And they suggest a third party investigation into these allegations so that the proper steps can be taken. And really, I think they just want admissions and accountability to be taken from people who have abused people within their community. So IHOPKC announced that they hired Stinson LLP, and many people, former members of the IHOPKC community, IHOPKC survivors, and the advocate group or the complaint group had a lot of concerns about this law firm and brought forward several issues that they thought could happen if they moved forward with this particular law firm. So, first of all, law firms have financial responsibility and a vested interest in their clients and in the people who hired them or the organizations that hired them, not necessarily in finding the truth. And this makes them not very great third party investigators. And this law firm in particular had a reputation for being very aggressive and defensive and didn't have a lot of experience in investigations of this nature. And they didn't really have, they weren't trauma informed, they were not survivor centered, and it didn't give the Jane Does and any other potential victims any confidence that their stories would be heard or believed or handled with care. I also think this announcement was just the beginning of a series of very weird, concerning, and absolutely, honestly, just dumb moves on IHOPKC's part of a just continued and repeated mishandling of allegations and situations of such a severe nature. So at this same church service, Michael Brown came in and spoke, saying to the congregation, "You may have an opinion right now, but keep it to yourself. It does no good. There is a process in place," and just asked everybody to wait and hold off on speaking about any opinions that you may have. He also asked people to delete any previous social media posts of opinions that they might have formed. And this is also a big form of information control within cults or cult like organizations. Gossip is highly, highly frowned upon. It's highly frowned upon in a lot of Christian organizations in general. And it's one of those things that's not necessarily frowned upon in society at large or groups or environments outside of cults or like more fundamentalist Christian organizations. Daniela Mestenik Young is a scholar of cults and extreme groups. She was also raised in the Children of God cult and then joined the US Army after she got out of the cult and wrote a book called Uncultured, where she compares her experiences in those two environments. She is a content creator mostly on TikTok, and she has made a few videos talking about gossip and how gossip is really just a form of information control and behavior control, and that leaders really would only worry about people gossiping if they're worried about them saying something negative or bad or telling people something that the leader would have an interest in other people not knowing. And she kind of talked about when she was a captain in the army that she didn't really have a no gossip policy, and she was never worried about people that she was in charge of speaking different languages around her that she didn't understand or around other people that they didn't understand. And when people confronted her and asked her why you wouldn't be worried about gossip, and she explained, because if people are gossiping and telling the truth, then the truth deserves to be told. She should be made aware of it, and other people deserve to be aware of it if it's the truth. And if it's not the truth, then it can be addressed and talked about and brought to light what the truth is, and it won't hold up to scrutiny, right? Like if it's something that someone's just spreading around and lying about, eventually it's going to get back to her and it can be addressed because it's not true. So it's not something she ever really worried about. But you know who would worry about it? Someone who did something bad, and then it gets spread around and it ends up being true. So, specifically asking people not to form opinions and not to process this with each other, talk about it with each other, go through their feelings with each other is suppressing like actual talking and healing that a community needs to do and should do. And it's just a very cult like move because it's often labeled as gossip, and the truth is often labeled as gossip. At this service, Stuart Greaves also claimed that some of the women named as victims of Mike Bickle's abuse have denied that they're actually victims, and they denounced the group of people claiming to represent Jane Does for using their names without permission. When I hear something like this, I think this is a wild accusation to bring forward to the community at large before you've done any or finished any investigations. Because when I read or hear or listen to something like that, I think, oh my gosh, is this all like a lie? Is this a fabrication? Did some men get together and put some women's names on a list and give it to other men? And then they go around and find out that these women like didn't actually accuse Mike Bickle of anything. And I know it said some, but like that's where your mind goes when you hear something like that, and that is really strategic. So what had happened was a few days before this, so prior to this church service, Misty Edwards, who is an IHOPKC worship leader, if you don't know, and a woman named April Rose, who was previously part of Mike Bickle's research team, posted on social media, on X and Instagram and Facebook, I believe, that they are not victims of Mike Bickle, and they both praised him for being a pure and godly man. And they both said they've never seen him ever do anything wrong in all of their time working with him ever. April Rose, in particular, claimed that someone from the complaint group or advocate group contacted her assuming she was a victim of something that they had heard about her secondhand. She was super adamant that nothing could be further from the truth, and her post about this was really lengthy, and she seemed really upset that she was accused of something that she didn't do. And again, we just get little bits and pieces of information here, and I still was really confused at this point as to what the heck was going on. But immediately when this was brought to my attention, I saw some serious red flags here, because I don't understand why Jane Does who don't want to be named in something and who claim they are not victims would come forward and identify themselves as these non-victims. It just seems really confusing. And when something is confusing like that, it's usually strategic and confusing for a reason. So this is another one of those things where I feel like these are Mike Bickle's kind of flying monkeys going forward to defend him from whatever he's being accused of, even though we still don't know the exact story. We still don't know exactly what he is being accused of. But this immediately kind of was a red flag to me of maybe this is a distraction. Maybe this is just something to confuse us and throw us off. And that's not to say, like, I don't know Misty Edwards. I don't know April Rose. I don't know who these women are. Obviously, if they are being accused of things that they didn't do, like, that's not good. And definitely that should be addressed. But if they are not the victims, who are, and what are their accusations? That was my question when I first heard this. So all of those shenanigans happen before, at, and around November 5th. And then by November 10th, IHOPKC announced that it would not proceed with the original law firm, Stinson LLP, due to the backlash online and the lack of trust from the victims that were named. Instead, they hired a local lawyer to interview the alleged victims. They said that she was highly qualified and they weren't going to share her name for her privacy. The advocate group and other IHOPKC survivors prefer to have a neutral third party like Grace, which is an organization. Grace stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. It was founded by attorney and grandson of Billy Graham. I don't know how to pronounce this man's name. Maybe I should find that out before I move forward with this. Boz Chividjian is what I have found. If I am wrong about that, I am sorry. Take it up with the interwebs, and please feel free to correct me in the comments. So they prefer someone like Boz Chividjian or Grace to do the third party investigating because Grace specifically has experience in independent investigations into these accusations. Also around this time, a man named Ben Anderson posted on social media, I think on X, that he knew the lawyer that IHOPKC hired, and this lawyer was part of the IHOPKC community at large. So IHOPKC supposedly listened to all the backlash and heard all of the concerns and decided to go with a lawyer within their own community. So they're going to say, oh, yeah, we understand. Maybe Stinson wasn't the right choice. Let's pick a lawyer that has even more of a conflict of interest instead. And let's not tell anyone that's what we're doing, because why would anyone ever find out who this lawyer is? I can't. I don't understand the thought process here. So obviously, the advocate group, the alleged victims, and the greater community at large were not happy with this. And everybody was like, what are you actually doing? But does IHOPKC and their leadership care what everyone online thinks, or what the actual alleged victims think, or what the people representing or bolstering the alleged victims think? No, they don't. They proceed on November 15th to release a report on initial findings. They claim that they have identified 5 of the 8 women that the advocate group claimed were victims. They said 3 of those women publicly called the allegations lies. A 4th refused to cooperate with IHOPKC's lawyer, probably because there was a conflict of interest. And 1 allegation allegedly predates IHOPKC's founding. So I guess IHOP doesn't think that matters. Again, don't ask me to explain their logic to you. I literally could never. They also said that 4 of the women said they did not consent to being put on the list. They basically say that they were given a list of names. IHOPKC claimed that the advocate group's allegations lacked any evidence or due process, and they questioned the true motives of the group. They also said hiring a third party to investigate was premature until they could establish credibility of the allegations and the genuine intent of the advocate group. I don't know why you would not just want a third party investigation to occur if you have nothing to hide, but okay. IHOPKC also claimed that they contacted Grace and found out that the founder, Boz, was now representing the main alleged victim. So they're not a neutral third party. They are now representing someone. So they were just like, well, what are we supposed to do? Obviously, there were many other organizations suggested, like Guidepost, who does the same type of internal investigations. And I'm sure a couple of other options were given. The preliminary findings also seemed to be referencing a mystery 50-page document that the advocate group allegedly gave to IHOPKC leadership, and we are going to talk about that more later in this deep dive. So things seemed to calm down for a couple of weeks after this because people were understandably confused. Like, was there anything to this? IHOPKC seems to think that this is not worthy of an investigation. And their preliminary statement actually reminded me of Rick Joyner and sounded like they were also saying this is a big old nothing burger and everyone should just move on. So I wasn't sure like what was going to come out next or if anything would happen in regards to these allegations. And then we get the bombshell interview and finally some more details as to what actually happened, which we are not entitled to, by the way. I think for all of us analyzing this and dissecting this, obviously the details are helpful. And obviously, because Mike Bickle and IHOPKC refused to admit to things that they've done and the ways in which they've mishandled this, I think Jane Doe in particular, was more or less forced to be public about this story and give details. Had accountability been taken and this been handled in the way, if there had been some level of accountability taken, I don't think we would be privy to these details. But because it wasn't, Jane Doe decided to speak out and share her story. Really quickly, before we dive into Jane Doe's story specifically, I want to give a trigger warning. This is when we get into the details of sexual assault and some really disturbing things that Mike Bickle actually did. So on November 30th, Julie Roys released on the Roys Report an exclusive interview with Jane Doe. This Jane Doe described her relationship with Mike Bickle beginning in 1996. She was 19 years old and he was 42 years old. Mike Bickle gave Jane Doe a significant prophetic word early on in this relationship, stating that he was a David and she was an Esther. A few weeks after that specific prophetic word was given, Mike Bickle called Jane Doe from Asia and he sounded really drunk. Jane Doe says that he prophesied to her that his wife, Diane, was going to die and that he and Jane Doe were going to get married because they were a perfect match and she had such a high calling on her life. From 1996 to 1999, Mike Bickle carried on a relationship with Jane Doe. He paid for an apartment for her to live in. He gave her a key to his office. And in this article, they said that he also engaged in sexual interactions with her. And he would tell her about this dream and this prophecy over and over and over again. Jane Doe told the Roys Report that she also witnessed Mike Bickle grooming other women and being inappropriate for years. In this report, Jane Doe goes on to give even more details. Mike Bickle also told Jane Doe that if she told anyone about his behavior or their relationship, that no one would believe her over him because he was such a significant man of God and heard so clearly from the Lord. Mike Bickle would also do things like control her schedule. He would invite her to fast with him from Sunday to Wednesday frequently, and he limited who she could see so that she could follow the isolation of the early desert fathers. She could only have a couple of friends at the time, and when she met with those friends, she was instructed to only talk about the Bible or Jesus with them. She couldn't have like casual hangouts with people. In 1997, Mike Bickle took his research team of 5 women and 1 man to Europe. And during this trip, he would often refer to his wife, Diane, as Lady Di. And he connected Princess Diana's recent death to his prophecy of his wife dying, which is so wild to me. This part of her story was extremely concerning to me because, like I mentioned earlier, Stephen Hassan's bite model that describes authoritarian and coercive control and undue influence lists several of these things under behavior and information control, instilling dependence and obedience on him if she's relying on Mike Bickle for her apartment and her livelihood, then she has really nowhere else to go outside of that relationship. He dictated where she lived, obviously. He regulated her eating and drinking by inviting her to fast with him. Keeping people hungry keeps them very confused and kind of off kilter, off balance, if you will, and makes it easier to influence them in different ways. Restricting her leisure time and activities and controlling who she has relationships with, and requiring her to spend major time on group indoctrination and rituals, including self indoctrination. She was allegedly a researcher for him at this time and only being allowed to talk to friends about Jesus and having to research specific things that he gave her to research is giving her major indoctrination time. And then he also gaslit her to doubt her own memory of these events, which we'll talk about later. And in emotional control, he made her feel elitist and special and love bombed her by saying that she was an Esther and she was going to replace his wife one day. So, continuing with Jane Doe's story, on the last day of this trip, Mike Bickle disappeared for the entire day. No one could locate him. And later that night, he called Jane Doe and invited her to dinner alone with him at a restaurant. He told her he splurged on everyone having their own hotel room for the night. Mike Bickle ordered rounds of cocktails at dinner and afterwards allegedly took Jane Doe to an alleyway and kissed her full on. The next thing she remembered was waking up the next morning in her hotel room. And she said she does remember being fully clothed, but remembers being extremely disoriented when she woke up. After this encounter, Mike Bickle frequently crossed the line with Jane Doe sexually and would have her pray a prayer of Psalm 51, asking the Lord to forgive them every time this happened. Sexual interactions included everything but intercourse, and she said she has a few memories in hotel rooms that were way worse than the Europe trip, which is honestly so sad and upsetting. I can't even imagine. So this relationship kind of came to an end because in 1998, Jane Doe's father bought a house for her to live in. So she was no longer living in the apartments that Mike Bickle was putting her in. And she began acquiring roommates to live in this house with her. Around this time, two other women also moved to Kansas City and joined IHOP, and they drew Mike Bickle's attention, which caused the meetings that Jane Doe and Mike Bickle were having to slow down. And then in late 1999 or early 2000 was their final encounter in a hotel room in Dallas. And after Jane Doe began moving on with her life from this period of holding Mike Bickle's attention, and she started dating her now husband, Mike Bickle became very angry with her. He actually officiated Jane Doe's brother's wedding, but he refused to officiate her wedding. And apparently, during her wedding, he walked up to the front and cried during the ceremony. And this information came from Jane Doe's brother. Apparently, like at the time, everybody thought like he just thought it was all so beautiful. But looking back on it with this lens, Jane Doe's brother said it was definitely a red flag. In March 2023, Jane Doe listened to a podcast about Bill Cosby's abuse, and it unearthed a lot of her trauma. And in May, she disclosed for the first time to her husband what had happened to her. And then apparently days later, Jane Doe's friend, seemingly out of the blue, asked her if Mike Bickle had ever been inappropriate with her, because allegedly there was another Jane Doe making some weird allegations, and Jane Doe said she broke down with her friend and told her a lot of things that she had disclosed to her husband. Ultimately, the prophecy that Mike Bickle's wife would die was the thread that tied several of these Jane Doe stories together, and we'll discuss later. Apparently, that's also what tied the advocate group together and helped people understand and believe what's going on. Mike Bickle has allegedly said this to multiple women as recently as 2021. While trying to hold IHOPKC accountable, Jane Doe's husband met with Mike Bickle to address what she had told him. And apparently, after that meeting, Mike Bickle emailed Jane Doe asking her not to go public. He said he had a different interpretation of what their relationship was like, and God did not see their relationship the way that she saw it. That is another power move, and using his spiritual authority against someone by saying he hears from God and knows God better than she does. That goes to the gaslighting that I had mentioned earlier. And he told her that if she went public with it, it would be the biggest betrayal of his life. And that is also exactly what he said when he preached this infamous dark horse prophecy after he had sent this email. Mike Bickle allegedly also has a policy that goes back a really long time since he started kind of becoming famous for being a prophet. He said that the Lord told him that he shouldn't or shouldn't ever or should never have to defend himself against any allegations. And I see that as another way of prepping his followers and people who believe he is a prophet to not believing other people when they come against him with accusations. He basically said he never wants to defend himself and never should have to defend himself, and the Lord will bring everything to light and make it all right in the end. But we actually see some of his admissions of guilt, but not anything where he outwardly defends himself. So on December 7th, the Roy's Report released a story stating that Mike Bickle confessed to bad judgment and bad mistakes with Jane Doe from back in 1996 to two separate leaders within IHOPKC. Allegedly, he didn't do this publicly, but some leaders came forward and said that when they confronted him about it, he was like, yes, there were some bad judgments and mistakes 20 years ago, but he didn't admit to anything more serious than that. Around this time, though, and in this same story released by the Roy's Report, a lot of IHOPKC leaders began to resign in the wake of these details made public by Jane Doe. So after the December 7th article on the Roy's Report, where Mike Bickle admits some things to allegedly some IHOPKC leaders, we don't hear anything for a couple of days. And then on December 10th, IHOPKC, who said, oh, there's nothing to see here, we can't substantiate anything, decides that they are going to announce that they have retained, and I kid you not, when I say this, I wrote that in my notes, I kid you not, a third law firm to investigate the allegations. This time, they hired the Lathrop Group from Kansas City, Missouri. And this firm boasts about defending church groups against sexual allegations. Again, why are they choosing the dumbest options for people to investigate this? Why on earth? Who is making this decision? Probably Mike Bickle, honestly. This feels very cult leader coded as someone who thinks they cannot be touched and that people will just believe whatever they say and whatever they do, so they don't have to be smart about it. Anywho, Jane Doe and her attorney, Boz, obviously don't think that this firm is going to conduct a fair and independent third-party investigation. Again, they have a financial commitment to IHOPKC, who hired them, and also they defend people against this for a living. Then finally, on December 12th, Mike Bickle publicly releases a statement confessing to inappropriate behavior 20 years ago and says that he does not admit to some of the more intense sexual activities, aka literal assault. But he said some of the more intense sexual activities that some people are suggesting. This statement was quite a shock to some people, but it was very carefully worded, and you could tell that he was not denying things, but not admitting to them. And it was carefully and strategically worded for sure. So then a few days after that, on December 20th or 21st, a man named Stephen Magnuson tweeted that he had confronted Mike Bickle after this and had nearly an hour-long conversation with him. And he accused Mike Bickle of acting like a low-level mafia guy and intimidating people that were trying to question him about his allegations. The mafia reference is very telling because, again, mafia, mob bosses, it's all very similar to cults. It's all undue influence and coercive control, narcissistic abuse, and manipulation. Stephen also demanded that IHOPKC give full transparency and admit to their inappropriate behavior and how they mishandled this whole situation from the beginning. Then on December 22nd, a full 10 days after Mike Bickle admitted publicly to some inappropriate behavior, IHOPKC announced that it is formally and permanently separating from founder Mike Bickle due to the inappropriate behavior. At this time, Stuart Greaves also resigned, and they announced that Military General Kurt Fuller is temporarily assuming the executive director position. No details were given about Mike Bickle's inappropriate behavior, and no reason was given for Stuart Greaves' resignation. This was kind of just a generalized and blanket statement. A few other things occurred towards the end of December and beginning of January that I do not list in detail because it was a lot of online discourse and tweets back and forth between several different people, just kind of sharing different perspectives of the situation and again demanding transparency from IHOPKC. A lot of former leaders started resigning publicly and sharing statements that they are resigning publicly, more so that like there was another wave of them that came kind of after this and after Mike Bickle's admissions. We still, however, don't get any transparency or any more information from IHOPKC or leadership or ELT about some of the inner workings and some of the things that were going on, and definitely no transparency into the whole saga. Then on January 16th, we get another significant event to happen through this whole saga. On January 16th, an appeal and protest statement is, as it's titled, is posted online by Misty Edwards and April Rose, the same two women that claimed really early on to have been wrongly named as victims of Mike Bickle. Again, I'm not going to read the entire statement, but I am going to read a couple of parts that I highlighted that I think were significant. And when I first read this statement, I was very confused as to what exactly it was they were trying to convey. So let's talk about that a little bit. So the appeal and protest statement starts off by saying, many of us alleged Jane Does have been silent throughout the months of the 3 IHOPKC investigations and difficult ordeal, which Misty and April were not silent at the beginning, but I suppose throughout the investigations they were. And they basically said, we've maintained our silence, desiring to retain whatever measure of privacy of life we could that was left after our lives were invaded by the violating behavior of those involved in a calculated Jane Doe campaign that is being done in the name of love, transparency, justice, and advocacy. They said, this has been painful, humiliating, and traumatizing to all of us. It says, we have engaged with 3 investigative legal teams that IHOPKC has brought in. These engagements have caused us to endure recurring humiliation, distress, trauma, and pain as we have had to have repeated conversations about humiliating topics concerning the insinuations and suggestions that others have projected onto our lives and workplace dynamics. They also say, we refuse to capitulate the narratives being promoted about our lives by some of the, quote, advocates. We have been threatened, called liars, Stockholm syndromed, accused of covering up, being mentally compromised, having memories repressed, being complicit, and even suicidal. They said, we are exhausted, humiliated, and done. They say, there is another group of victimized women here, the women and former women of this house who have been forced to engage in this horror show against our will for the sake of someone else's agenda against Mike Bickle and IHOPKC. They also say that their lives have been bullied and abused by those in the so-called advocate group. Then they go on to say, the damage done has been devastating and cruel. We are simple, quiet people who just wanted to worship Jesus and pray for the nations. We wait for the throne room of judgment. We wait for the throne room judgment of Jesus Christ when all true things will be laid bare and vindication will be eternal. I highlighted that part because my thoughts when I read we are simple, quiet people who just wanted to worship Jesus and pray for the nations, no one would have known who they were if they didn't publicly themselves say, hey, we've been accused of being Jane Does and we are not. So like I said, I had a really hard time understanding what they meant and what was going on when they released that statement, because I saw that they had denied being Jane Does and said that some people have accused them of having, like, of Mike Bickle assaulting them, and he didn't. So they publicly just said, we are not part of this. We are not Jane Doe. So I was like, why would you again make a statement about this if you say that you are not part of this. And then I thought there were a lot of red flags there because hypothetically, if I were in their situation, and I'm not in their situation, so obviously, like, I can't know for sure what I would do if I were them. I am not in their shoes. But if someone came to me and said they heard something secondhand about me that wasn't true, and that I was named in a group of Jane Does, and it simply wasn't true, I would just A, tell everyone it wasn't true, and B, ask, like, oh my gosh, this didn't happen to me, but did it happen to someone else? What are these other stories? What is going on? I would be curious and inquisitive, and I wouldn't think that just because nothing happened to me, that nothing happened to someone else. It seems as though Misty Edwards and April Rose are taking their experiences and saying because they haven't experienced anything bad with Mike Bickle that it's not possible that anyone else has. And I just can't understand why someone would make that kind of a statement or make that kind of an assumption unless they are indoctrinated into a cult and are under undue influence and coercive control. And the reason I say that is because when you are in a cult or under undue influence, your critical thinking, you don't rely on your critical thinking or normal thought processes in situations like this. You either just do what the leader tells you to do or just do what you've been indoctrinated to do, which is often defend the leader or the group at all costs. And my other thought on it was even if they are being bullied and harassed by the advocate group or some people in the advocate group or people who they think have a vendetta against Mike Bickle and IHOPKC, even if that is the case and that is true, their stories are theirs to tell, and they are welcome to come forward with those stories, and they are welcome to tell those stories. But that still does not mean that no one's story is true. So after this appeal and protest statement was published and shared, there was some discourse online, and people were asking, like, what are they talking about? Where were they named? What people had questions about the 50-page document that was referred to in a lot of IHOPKC's statements. People were wondering, was there a list given to IHOPKC leadership or wasn't there? I think some people from the advocate group denied that there was a list. So on January 20th, Eric Voles, who is IHOPKC's spokesperson, posted on X a redacted page of the alleged 50-page document claiming to prove that the advocate group did give a list to IHOPKC naming Jane Does for them to use to further investigate the allegations. This was what was posted and obviously redacted. You can see, well, you can't if you're listening to this on the podcast. For those of you who can't see, this says main document, table of contents, 1, allegations, and then there's a list, sub list dot that says introduction. And then under introduction, it says overview of primary allegations and expanded details of primary allegations. Number 2 says the victims, Jane Doe 2, and then in parentheses, it has the years 1983 to 1999, Jane Doe 3, 1996 to 1999, and Jane Doe 5, 2013 to 2018 via ex-husband, and then it's redacted. And then under each Jane Doe, all the information is redacted, and then there's a small redacted paragraph under that. Then it says additional Jane Does not yet ready to be named. And then under that, it says other Jane Does 1, 4, 6, 7, and 8. And because of how it's set up and the redacted parts, it does look like after Jane Does 1, 4, 6, 7, and 8, there's like a little bit of text, what could be a paragraph, where it looks like names could have been shared there. It looks like there could be information there. So the way that it was posted and the way Eric Voles framed it, it looked like there was a list given of Jane Does that are numbered and then potentially named. So then people have a lot more questions. So after this, on January 21st, Dean Briggs posts a long statement on Facebook. I will link that in the description as well, so you can go read the whole thing. It is super long, but I've pulled out some parts of it that I found significant. So he primarily addresses the appeal to and protest statement and the 50-page document that contains the supposed list of Jane Does. And finally, in this Facebook post is where I feel like we start to get some clarity and understanding and insight into what the heck is going on behind the scenes that makes this all so confusing. So Dean Briggs says that a 50-page working document was compiled as a way to organize and facilitate the disclosure of allegations that the advocate group was aware of to IHOPKC's executive leadership team after their attempts to confront Mike Bickle himself were thwarted, as Dean Briggs says. And that's when Mike Bickle manipulated people and didn't want to be confronted. It says this document contained a detailed list of allegations from 3 Jane Doe storylines, including 2 personal impact statements written by 2 Jane Does, each of whom shared their stories directly, with a 3rd impact statement coming not from a suspected Jane Doe herself, but from her husband, whose marriage has been shattered by events he painfully communicated from his own firsthand experience. It also included direct and secondary support material intended to communicate the full gravity of concerns. Out of the 50 pages, roughly 20 contained the direct allegations and impact statements. And then he went on to say the rest was support materials and evidence. He also did say in this post that they realized that when this document was given to the ELT, however they came to have possession of it, some things were not printed out correctly. So that's why they thought that there was no evidence to back up some of these claims, allegedly. He also went on to say that the point of the document was not to prove anything, was not to state this is exactly what happened and here's all of the evidence, but it was just meant to start a conversation with the executive leadership team around legitimate concerns that merited further serious and deliberate biblical inquiry. It was also not a document for public consumption nor for internal distribution outside of the ELT. It became clear that it was distributed internally to many different people, including freaking Mike Bickle himself. The advocate group did not seek out this information and then attempt to build a case. 3 cases came to various ones among us from different directions in roughly simultaneous fashion. Having heard these stories, you can't unhear them, is what he said. So Dean Briggs, who was part of the advocate group, said, we didn't give anyone a list. We didn't even give someone a document intended to be evidence, intended to prove something happened or didn't happen. And we did not go looking for Jane Does to build a case against Mike Bickle. We came upon this information at different times, but around the same time frame, realized between all of us that this is what was going on. And after confronting Mike Bickle himself about it and getting nowhere, decided to bring this to IHOPKC's executive leadership team. So now we know that there were 2 Jane Does that wrote statements themselves that have allegations against Mike Bickle, and 1 Jane Doe's ex-husband who allegedly wrote an impact statement as well. And then they listed a number of potential other Jane Does that did not claim themselves to be Jane Does, that they had not verified. It was just a point of reference to say, we should probably ask these women too, based off of some things that other people have heard. He also said the 2 Jane Does plus 1 suspected Jane Doe were only listed by their initials, with the story of the 3rd being supplied by an aggrieved husband. In each case, they self-identified and granted permission for their stories and their initials to be used. In addition, 5 other possible Jane Does were listed for one reason only. Each of them, whether directly or by the testimony of others, were associated with the now infamous and highly troubling language of getting in the chariot with Mike and or Diane will die and we will be together. These phrases show a pattern of predatory behavior. The timeline showed points where those phrases popped up, spanning decades, clearly admitted as secondhand information and noted only by numbers. At no point did any advocate group members, to my knowledge, have any discussions with the anonymous 5 possible Jane Does, except one instance where a female advocate group member reached out to one of the unnamed possible Jane Does out of concern for her well-being, and another instance when that same person initiated a conversation with another advocate group member to deny being a Jane Doe. So this means Misty Edwards and April Rose publicly self-identified as possible Jane Does while simultaneously claiming to not be Jane Does. Why did they feel it necessary to identify themselves publicly? If if the advocate group didn't inform them, who did? Who associated them as points on a generic timeline lacking names, and why did they accept that association as worthy of denial when the timeline itself had no inherent ability to implicate them? Those are really good questions to ask. Dean Briggs also goes on at the end of this Facebook post to talk about why this is the wrong conversation to be having. And I could not agree with him more, because he basically reiterated all of the things that I thought were red flags about Misty Edwards' public posts from the beginning. Because the questions shouldn't be about women who say they're not Jane Does. If you're not Jane Does, great. Like that's good. Nobody wants you to be. Nobody wants you to be Jane Does if you are not. So why the back and forth? Why the constant posting about it? Why the accusations that this is just something to take down Mike Bickle? The conversation should be around the Jane Does who self-identified and the ex-husband who was bringing something up. Those should be the conversations. That is what Mike Bickle should be answering for. That is what IHOPKC and a third-party neutral investigative team should be investigating. But instead, they are trying to say, hey, look over here at all this going on. Try to figure out this really confusing thing with us, when nobody needs to be worried about this and needs to be figuring it out. And admittedly, I was confused and very distracted by it until I went through this whole timeline to figure out, like, okay, what the heck is going on? And I do appreciate the additional details given by the advocate group and the Jane Does that we didn't really need from the beginning, and they wouldn't have had to give had this confusion not been brought up in the first place. Also on January 21st, Dwayne Roberts posted on X addressing the 50-page document. He said, recent statements by Eric Voles on social media and in public meetings have made it clear to us that a significant portion of the narrative that IHOPKC is presenting internally is predicated upon a, quote, 50-page document, which was provided to Stuart Greaves in confidence. Eric Voles posted a page of this document this evening in an attempt to prove a list of victims was included. Because of this, we want to provide some clarity related to this document, its creation, and its intended purpose. So Dwayne Roberts basically stated that no one formally agreed to the document. Again, it wasn't put together as like perfect evidence to prove a point. It was just a compilation of statements and supporting evidence. Multiple people gathered together, and it was referred to during a meeting between Dwayne Roberts, Wes Martin, and Brian Kim, and the husband of one of the Jane Does. On October 25th, at Stuart Greaves' request, Dwayne Roberts says, I handed over a copy of this working document with full trust that it was for his eyes only. Stuart asked for the names of other women of concern, and I verbally told him some details about other troubling situations eyewitnesses saw to other troubling situations by eyewitnesses to wrongdoing by Mike Bickle. I must have written this wrong, or maybe he wrote it wrong. Sorry, guys. He said, I verbally told him some details about other troubling situations and wrongdoings by Mike Bickle that eyewitnesses had brought to me, and some names which I now fully regret doing. So it is possible that Dwayne Roberts did name Misty Edwards and April Rose. Again, just as something he heard secondhand, which again is not trying to prove anything or say they are for sure victims, just saying in confidence, I've also heard this, and this. He did not think he would then take that to Mike Bickle and the entire executive leadership team and then use it in meetings and try to question someone like Misty Edwards and April. Then on January 23rd, Misty Edwards posts, deletes, and reposts a statement to X. It is currently still deleted and not included in any of her profiles, but I have it right here. I am going to read this one. Misty Edwards says, I stand behind the recent Jane Doe appeal and protest statement, and I want to be clear that I did not independently write it. It is the collaboration of several women, though my experiences with some in the advocate group and those associated with them, not IHOPKC or the third parties they have already engaged with, are included in it. If any follow-up statements will be made from these wrongfully named Jane Does, it will be here, and she tags a X Twitter profile Jane Doe group. This statement is in reference to what seems to have been a plan that was put in place behind closed doors in order to bring down Mike Bickle and IHOPKC. It seems to have been a plan before there were multiple alleged Jane Does. In my opinion, there was a plan, and then the search for victims to fill that 40-year timeline began. Then they had names based on secondhand conversations and did not contact these women before they went forward with their story as though it were fact. Though they did not state these women's names in writing, they used their secondhand stories to bolster the number and make it look like multiple women were accusing Mike. That is what I am speaking against. I want to also say that I am not negating the one woman's story from 25 years ago that was given firsthand and brought forth in her own words. This is not what I am referencing. I am sincerely praying for mercy for all involved, grace and peace. So she responds to people saying, you not being a Jane Doe does not mean that this woman also isn't a Jane Doe. And she was basically saying, I'm not negating that. However, she says that there are not multiple women, but there are at least three. There are three who through them or an ex-husband, there were direct statements where they are self-identifying. So that means multiple. And one of those was fairly recent, not 20 years ago. And they were clear from the beginning that they did not know for sure and had only heard secondhand about the other women, which apparently included Misty Edwards and April Rose. So on January 24th, after Misty Edwards posted and took down her post, Dwayne Roberts posted on X addressing the appeal to protest statement. He said a recent statement released entitled The Jane Doe Appeal and Protest Statement has begged some legitimate questions about the ongoing situation related to allegations of Mike Bickle's misconduct. The following statement will seek to address some of those questions. In this, he clarifies who is part of the alleged advocate group and introduces YouTube videos. This is new to the whole saga and kind of a big deal. We're going to get to those. But he introduces YouTube videos that clarify how the advocate group came together and why they decided to bring these allegations to the public. Dwayne Roberts also clarifies that he did speak to Stuart Greaves and did discuss some specific names that he now absolutely regrets doing. And had he known how Stuart and IHOPKC leadership would have responded to that, he wouldn't have named those specific Jane Does that he had heard about secondhand. He did say, though, that at no point since then has there been any contact with any of these women, with the exception of Misty Edwards. Jennifer Roberts met with Misty on October 24th in a non-confrontational meeting and discussed with her the abuse the main Jane Doe suffered with this main Jane Doe's permission. At Misty's request, Misty did indeed speak to a few other advocate group members to hear Misty's side, which I think is interesting because I don't know why Misty has a side in this specific Jane Doe story, but take that, do with that information what you will. These conversations were ones of humble listening and would in no way be characterized as bullying or trying to force anything onto Misty. From the statement, it would appear the women are opposed to being interviewed again as they consider this abuse. We are deeply sorry that these women were seemingly forced to be interviewed 3 times, but the advocate group cannot be held responsible for a process unilaterally determined by IHOPKC and in which we have no involvement. Dwayne Roberts also explained that the advocate had no control over how many times the self-identified Jane Does have been interviewed, as they never agreed on a mutual investigation. And further, if IHOPKC agrees to a true third-party neutral investigation, these Jane Does would not have to be interviewed again, and their previous interviews could be submitted as evidence in an effort to not traumatize anyone any further. And he also said on Tuesday, January 16th, we had a meeting with Eric Voles, General Fuller, and the IHOPKC attorney. Towards the end of that meeting, IHOPKC proposed a way of moving forward with the third-party investigation whereby there would be two co-equal investigators. One investigator would be selected by IHOPKC, and that investigator is Rosalie McNamara, and the other investigator would be selected by the Jane Doe representative, Boz Chividjian. 2 days later, Mr. Chividjian informed IHOPKC of our choice. It is 1 week later, and IHOPKC has yet to respond to our choice. IHOPKC publicly claims that they want to find a way forward with a third-party investigation that is acceptable to all of us. In reading this for you guys right now, I think it's interesting that on January 16th was when they had a meeting with Eric Voles and General Fuller. And I'm pretty sure what also happened on the 16th. On the 16th was when the appeal and protest statement was made public by Misty Edwards and April Rose. Interesting. So now let's talk about those YouTube videos that Dwayne Roberts linked in his statement on X. So because this group of people has been consistently referred to as the Advocate Group, they claimed the name and made a YouTube channel and released 3 YouTube videos with more details on the allegations and how they came to be. They have a man named Jono Hall interviewing the people in all of these videos. So the first video is a conversation between Jonah Hall, Alan Hood, Wes Martin, and Dwayne Roberts. That's the longest of all of the videos. The second video is a conversation between Jonah Hall, Dean Briggs, and John Chisholm. The third video, I put second video on this slide, but it is the third video, is Jonah Hall with Elizabeth Herder and Jennifer Robert. And like I said, these videos give more details and a couple like bombshell revelations that I don't think anyone saw coming. In this video with Dean Briggs and John Chisholm, we learned that Mike Bickle's son, Luke Bickle, was having an affair with a department head's wife. So this would be who Dean Briggs and a couple of other people referred to when they were talking about that 50-page document and whose statements were submitted. This would have been the wife of the ex-husband who submitted that statement about that Jane Doe. They also said that Mike Bickle engaged in very inappropriate interactions with this department head's wife before she had an affair with Luke Bickle. So the husband, they say, was destroyed in double fashion by Mike Bickle's influence on his wife and then by Luke Bickle's full-on affair with her. Dean and John then go on to detail how they tried to get answers and handle the situation with Mike Bickle and Stuart Greaves when they became aware of this. And all that happened was manipulative conversations and alleged cover-ups by Mike Bickle and Stuart Greaves, eventually leading to both men leaving IHOPKC. In the long video with the 3 men, we get even more details on Mike Bickle's dark horse prophecy, which is what we started this video and this deep dive with. So in this video, Alan Hood and Dwayne Roberts detail just how troubling and disturbing that sermon actually was. They said in the video, in October, Bickle preached that a personal attack was coming, but that God would release his wrath against those who betrayed him. According to Hood, Bickle preached that the Lord would release tokens of heavenly storm glory against this assault. Hood added that Bickle also cited King David, who prayed that his betraying friend would go to hell. So Alan Hood was basically saying, so I wrote him about this and said, are you really praying for tokens of heavenly storm glory to go down and kill Jane Doe? He said, are you really praying for heavenly token of storm glory to kill honest, sincere brethren who are coming to you with a legitimate accusation? This is unthinkable. And yeah, it is unthinkable. So that dark horse prophecy was not just Mike Bickle creating a narrative for his followers. He was directly threatening Jane Doe with that sermon. We also got details in the first 2 videos about how Mike Bickle has seemingly been preparing for something like this for a few years now. And honestly, these are some signs of cults getting towards the end of their lifespan where they're kind of locking themselves down and trying to buffer from the outside world and any issues or accusations or things that could come against the cult. So we learned that Mike Bickle disbanded the IHOPKC board back in 2020. So Mike Bickle used a similar Black Horse prophecy to create a firewall between Mike Bickle and IHOPKC. Bickle said he was going to experience an attack from woke culture for his views on gender, sexuality, and Israel. And the board agreed to remove Bickle from any official role so that if someone sued him, the prayer ministry could continue and wouldn't be affected by someone suing him. The board also agreed to disband and withdraw from IHOPKC from the Evangelical Council on Financial Accountability, which is super interesting because Julie Roys, this was the thing that she reported on with IHOPKC before she started covering this latest scandal. And she reported on it as a red flag, as, hey, why would this church remove itself from a third-party outside entity of accountability? What could possibly be going on here? Chisholm talked about how people ask, like, why would you allow that? Why would you allow IHOPKC and Mike Bickle to be removed from accountability? And he says, I look back now and the issue is his brand is so strong, we don't need accountability. So I went along with that. But Bickle was still at every executive leadership team meeting and at most worship leaders meetings. Briggs noted that at the same time the accountability structure for Bickle was ending, that's when Luke Bickle's affair was heating up. So I actually think he did a good job in this video also explaining the mindset when you're in the cult, in the in-group, in the inner circle. The sacred assumption, as Daniela Mestinick-Young calls it, it's one of the characteristics of a cult, is that Mike Bickle is a man of God, that he is a prophet, that he is hearing directly from the Lord, and that he wouldn't, like, that's the only accountability he needs, and he wouldn't do anything wrong. So what is the need for any outside accountability when you know for certain that Mike Bickle is a man of God and wouldn't do anything that he needed to be held accountable for? And that's what they're kind of saying is, like, we realized we were so wrong and he is not who he claimed to be. I also really thought the video with Elizabeth Herder and Jennifer Roberts was really important and great at explaining the mindset when you're in a cult. They described why none of Mike Bickle's affairs could be classified as consensual and how he groomed women and behaviors that they witnessed him do and wrote off as Mike Bickle just not having a clue or being weird. And they said he would do things all the time, like play footsie with women under a table, which is so gross. They also described how it was women who were seen as weird or having something weird going on or having some kind of inappropriate obsession with Mike Bickle if he paid too much attention to, like, any certain girl in particular. So they said when they would notice women go into his office a lot or get preferential treatment or seemingly be spending a lot of time with him, they thought, oh, she must have something wrong with her. She must be weird, because Mike Bickle couldn't possibly be doing anything wrong because he is a prophet and a man of God and a godly person and would never, ever do anything that he would need to be held accountable for. So now, after these videos were released, IHOPKC responds in the most bizarre and, again, like, worst possible way they could ever respond to these new details coming forward, which is what they've done every step of the way. So I don't know why we would expect anything different now. But they released a 5-ish minute video with kind of a response to these videos. So yeah, on the same day, January 24th, current IHOPKC leader General Kurt Fuller made a 5-minute statement about the videos the advocate group released. He claimed the advocate group lied to him and refused to give him much needed important information. He seemingly made it clear, at least this is what I got for from the video, that they will not be cooperating with anything the advocate group suggests moving forward because he feels so betrayed by these videos. He stated that IHOPKC will take the information they received from their independent investigator and decide what they want to do with it and who they are going to hold accountable. I also remember seeing somewhere in my research, and going back through it, I couldn't point to exactly where it was, but I remember someone representing IHOPKC stating that they didn't want to go with any of the third-party investigators that the advocate group was recommending because they wanted to look at IHOPKC as a whole, and IHOPKC was choosing to hire investigators that were just looking into Mike Bickle and the specific allegations against him and whether those had any credibility to begin with. But in these videos, the advocate group also talks about how they think that IHOPKC as a whole needs to be investigated from the beginning. They think from its conception, essentially. And Alan Hood made a great point where he said, when I say that IHOPKC needs to be investigated thoroughly from the beginning, I'm suggesting that I be investigated because I was part of it too for so long. But I want any wrongs to be made right. And that's what everyone in this situation should want. They should want an investigation to bring forward the truth of things that have happened. And I think it's been made clear by just the refusal to cooperate and the many missteps and mishandlings that we've just seen IHOPKC do since October that IHOPKC has something to hide. And if you've been paying attention since before this scandal, you know that there have been several other things happening within that organization that absolutely should be investigated. There are other survivors. There are other people that have been irreparably harmed by IHOPKC that also deserve for their stories to be heard if they want it, but also for acknowledgement and apology and whatever form of justice is possible at this point in time. So finally, we've made it basically up until present day. And a couple of other things have been released since then that you can find in Julie Roy's investigations. Mike Brown said something that basically saying that he agrees that IHOP should be investigated, but I also have criticisms with what he came out with as well. And then another guy posted a statement defending Mike Bickle and saying he hopes he's restored to ministry. Honestly, I don't want to give that too much reporting or too much attention because those guys are dumb and that is not what this is about. I think General Fuller's statement made it clear that IHOPKC isn't going to do anything moving forward. And I do think that Mike Bickle probably will be restored to ministry because that's what happens in cults like this. And that's what happens to cult leaders. And even if he doesn't come back to IHOPKC in particular, because they did say they permanently separated from him due to the allegations, he will likely move on and be the head of another ministry and will still have his followers and still have people like Rick Joyner and whatever that other guy is backing him and saying that he is a man of God and a prophet, and he will just start over. And we've seen this before with people like Mark Driscoll. Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill had a huge, huge public falling where a lot was exposed and people were seeking justice for specific things. And he just went and started another church in Arizona. Mark Driscoll was absolutely also a cult leader and also very cult-like. And his new church in Arizona is even more culty and even more isolated and even more locked down than Mars Hill was. And I assume Mike Bickle is going to attempt to do the same thing because we have seen no accountability, no admission, nothing of the sort. I also just wanted to say, for those of you who have made it through this whole thing to the end, if you are a member of the IHOPKC community, maybe you've recently left and you're learning a lot of this, maybe you're IHOPKC adjacent and you are reeling from all of this information. Maybe you've been out of it for a while. Maybe you're just realizing some of the things that you've been part of. I just want to let you know that you're not alone. The whole IHOPKC community, I'm sure, is reeling from this. It can be really hard to think that a church you were a part of or something that you were part of is culty or cult-like. I didn't realize Morningstar was culty. Like, even when I started studying cults and understanding coercive control and undue influence, I still didn't see my experience at Morningstar as culty because I didn't experience a lot of the abuse and harm, and I wasn't in the inner circle. But that doesn't mean I can't look at people who were harmed and see the abuse and the control and the undue influence that went on in the inner circle and understand that that is culty. Even if my experience wasn't super culty, someone else's was. And Rick Joyner is still very much like a cult leader and exists somewhere on that spectrum. And cults do exist on a spectrum. It's not just black and white. This is a cult. This is not a cult. This is super harmful. This isn't harmful at all. There can be a continuum and a spectrum of harm and influence and things that are experienced. And it is complicated and nuanced. And there's so much to learn and understand and unpack from your experience, no matter where it fell on the spectrum and no matter like what you experienced in this cult-like environment. I also just want to encourage you and say that there is life and faith outside of cults and cult-like churches and cult-like leaders. Admitting that IHOPKC was a cult or cult-like, or that Mike Bickle is an abusive leader, doesn't mean you have to give up your faith. It doesn't mean you have to leave the church. It doesn't mean you will have no community ever again. You can find faith and find Christianity and find community in a healthy environment. It does exist. I personally have chosen to leave that environment altogether. That's where my experience has led me. And that is a possibility too. You might lose your faith. You might leave the church altogether. You might leave Christianity altogether. There are so many paths to take, and your experience is unique and it will be your own. And it might be hard, but there is a whole community of people that have experienced the same thing and walked this path, and people who talk about this and unpack this and are healing from this. And so I just wanted to say that you're not alone, and there are people here for you and ready to support you and talk about it if that's what you want and if that's the path that you choose. Either way, whether you retain your faith and Christianity and find a community, find another community or not, I do highly recommend you learn a little bit about cults and coercive control and maybe the bite model and just some red flags of authoritarian control and culty environments, because it's also really common to cult hop and go from one cult to another if you haven't deconstructed your cult experience and learned what to look out for unhealthy environments. It's what you've learned, it's what you're used to, and so it's normal and it makes sense for you to jump from one to the other until you really unpack why it is you find yourself in those communities, what they look like, and why it's unhealthy. So that's it for this video. That's all I wanted to say. Please make sure you like and subscribe if you've made it this far. I talk about all different kinds of cults. I talk a lot about pop culture and trending topics as well. I do a lot of videos on Scientology and celebrity cult members, and I have some YWAM deep dives on the channel that you should check out if you haven't seen those yet. And it can also be really helpful to learn about cults and learn about cults that aren't your own cult. Sometimes it can be really hard and feel difficult and sometimes re-traumatizing to learn about cults through the perspective of your own cult or even like the genre of your own cult. But sometimes if you're from something like IHOPKC and you learn about Scientology, it can be easier to learn about it and spot the patterns without being re-traumatized and vice versa. So you don't have to learn about it from me. You don't have to learn about it from anyone specific, but I just recommend that you do. And I do have a lot of those videos on my channel if you're interested in this and if you're seeing more in the future. Thanks for making it to the very end, for those of you who have made it this far. And I will see you next time on No Culty Vibes. Bye.